So in today's class, we are going to be talking about storage and database on AWS. But before we start talking about the storage and database, let's look at the course objective or this module objective. So at the end of this module, you'll be able to understand the basic concepts of storage and database. You'll be able to understand the use of AWS Amazon Elastic Block Store and its benefits. Then you also understand the use of Amazon Simple Storage Service, which is an S3, one of the most used service on AWS and its benefit. Then you will also get familiarized with the Amazon Elastic File System, which is another storage, but a file storage, but we also use on AWS. Then after that, we're going to explain, or you'll be able to explain the difference between the solution, between the storage solution, you'll be able to explain the difference between the storage solutions and basic solutions on AWS. I don't even remember what I wrote there, but I understand what I'm trying to say there, that we'll be able to understand and explain the basic storage solution on AWS. There are multiple or different kind of solutions, storage solutions that you can have on AWS. There are some complex ones and there are some basic ones. So the objective of this is that you'll be able to understand the basic storage solution on AWS. Then you also understand the main relational or main database services that AWS provide, which is Amazon RDS and DynamoDB. Those are the two major services, database services that company use a lot. And those are not the only service. There are other services too, which if you have time, we might go into them just briefly. But these are the two major services that companies tend to use a lot when it comes to database. One is relational database, and the other one is non-relational database. All right, those are the module objective. Then to understand those module objectives, these are the topics that we are going to cover. We're going to cover Amazon storage, Amazon database, or AWS storage and AWS database, then other database services. The knowledge check, if you have this PowerPoint or PowerPoint slide, so you can do the knowledge check on your own. I'm not going to get there tonight because of our time. But if you have the file, I've shared the file already, and if you don't have access to it, you can actually go to our website and download it. It's going to be under the first course, under the first video, which is for the first course. That's where you're going to see this presentation file, so you can download it and be using it to follow us. All right, with that being said, so the first topic, AWS storage. Before I jump into the AWS storage, let's take some minutes, just like I always do. Let's also understand, how do we get here? You don't just jump into AWS storage or any of the AWS services without you understanding what company use before the AWS or before cloud. So when we talk about computer networking, which is having multiple computers connected together, communicate together, share file and data together. In every company or companies that you visit, their computer networking, we have a lot of information technology components or devices. And among these components, we have router, we have switch, we have firewall, and a lot of them, load balancer, network monitoring tools, backup devices. But the service that we are going to be looking at today, because of storage, or the services that actually has or that has the capacity to provide storage and database for company, which is the server. Your server has a storage embedded in it. Your laptop has a storage. And also the server also has some, you can also use a server for a database. And apart from using server to store your information or as a storage, or using server as a database, there are also some other storage devices that they are standalone. They are mainly for storing data. An example of that is all these external hard drive. They are not embedded directly in a server, but you can plug them to a server and it's going to provide you storage capacity. Somebody say, where can I find the file that you just talked about? Is it in the modified? No, when you go to our website, before we finish, remind me, are we, or anybody that have downloaded it can post it in the Telegram so that other people can have access to it. All right. So when we talk about components of a computer, there are multiple components of a computer or a server. But the focus today is these two, the hard disk and the solid state drive, because this is the storage that is embedded in the server or in your regular computer. So when we say embedded in your regular computer, does that mean that storage can only be embedded in a computer? Well, that is not always true, or that is not 100% right. We have different way of attaching storage to server. There are multiple ways of attaching storage to server. First, you can attach a storage to a server directly, like a one-to-one relationship. And your laptop has storage, and the storage is embedded inside your laptop. The same way servers also have storage that is embedded in them. So that storage can only be used by that computer or by that server. Then we have another means of attaching data or attaching storage device to a server, which is an external storage. You can attach an external storage to a server. And by attaching an external storage to multiple server or to a server, it makes that storage accessible by multiple server. Just like if you have an hard drive, if there is a way for you to connect the hard drive to two servers at the same time, that storage is like a shared server or a shared storage. So the same way in the data center, there are some server or some storage devices that are specifically made for sharing data between multiple servers. This is different from one-to-one relationship. This is one-to-many relationship. You have one storage that is catering for the storage need of multiple servers. And the third way is having a standalone storage. There are some storage that they are not attached to any server. They are just there by themselves. Possibly the company used them for like a disaster recovery means. Maybe they just want to keep a copy of their data. They want to keep a copy or some copy of their files. So they don't attach it to any server. Possibly just a copied storage from an active storage. So these are the means of different or multiple ways of attaching storage to servers. So what are the types of storage that we have? There are multiple types of storage. multiple types of storage. There is a storage called block storage. There is another kind of storage called file storage, and we have object storage. These three types of storage has different use cases. And all of them, if somebody asks which one of them is the best, there is no best or better one among each other because they serve different need. So when we talk about block storage, this looks like a set of block that when you want to save data in a block storage, the data is actually stored in a specific block on that storage. So when you try to modify the data, it is only that block that the data that you want to modify is stored that will be modified. For example, let's say, look at this blue here. If you can see this blue, let's say this blue wants to be modified to something like green. So this blue, I'm talking about this blue. So if you modify this blue, the entire block storage will remain the way it is, but the block where that blue is located will be the only one that will be modified to green, just like this. So the entire block will not be refreshed. You know, when you update a file, or let's say you are browsing on a website and maybe you save, let's say, for example, you open your bank account on your website and you deposit some money and you were like, the money I deposit is not showing here. But guess what? What you need to do, you need to refresh the page so that it will load and you will see the updates. But that loading, in basic terms, it actually affects the entire page will load. But there are ways we can avoid this, but we are not going there because we are not developers. There are multiple ways of doing that the entire page will not reload. Only the service or only the specific components that you modify will reload. But that is not what we are talking about here. We are talking about the storage. So when you save data inside this block, it is only that block that will be modified. So that will prevent all the system being reloaded every time. So let's say you want to modify this orange to red, then it is only that red block that will be modified. The entire block will not be refreshed. They will not be restart. So that is block storage. When we talk about block storage on AWS, AWS provides us a service that you can use for block storage. And not only one storage, not only one service, there are multiple, like two of them. One is called the Elastic Block Service or Elastic Block Storage, EBS, Elastic Block Storage Volume. So if you have a client that tells you that maybe you are drawing an architectural diagram or you are helping a client to migrate from on-prem to the cloud, then the clients tell you that, hey, we have a block storage that we use on-prem. Do we have solution for that in the cloud? Your answer is yes, because AWS provide a service that you can use for block storage. So your clients that wants to migrate from on-prem to the cloud, because they have a block storage on-prem, what you just need to do is to create a elastic block storage volume for them in the cloud. So AWS Elastic Block Storage is a block storage in the cloud. So the second storage that we have is called the instance store volume. Instance store volume. The instance store volume is also a block storage. So the question that might be in your mind now is, what is the difference between elastic block storage volume and instance store volume. Well, the difference between the two is that the first one, elastic block storage volume, is a persistent storage volume. What I mean by a persistent storage volume is that if you detach the volume, or you can detach the volume away from that server that is embedded to, and plug the volume to another server, and you will still have your data. You can terminate the server that is using that volume. It's only the server that will be terminated. The volume will still remain, and your data that you save inside the volume will still be accessible. So what that means is that the lifespan of an elastic block storage volume is different from the lifespan of the server that is using that volume. Meanwhile, the second one, which is instance store volume, is not a persistent volume, meaning that it is attached directly. It's like an hard disk attached directly to a system. If you terminate that system, the volume is gone. You can't have access to the volume. So the lifespan of the volume and the lifespan of the server is the same. When you save a data in an instance store volume, if you terminate that server from where you save the data, this data you save is gone. And the reason for this is because when you have a volume, when you have a server, and you attach elastic block store, EBS, to that server, it's just like you are just plugging a socket or a plug to the wall socket, which means you can remove it later. But when we talk about instance volume, is that you created that socket and you just like they create both the socket and the plug together, which means you cannot remove them from each other. And I will give you a better example later, but before that, let's look at the features of EBS. An Amazon or AWS EBS service, EBS volume is a service that provides block level storage volume for use with EC2 instance. If you have and this is mainly for EC2 instance, not for database, not for any other service. It's only for EC2 instance. So if you have a volume, or you have a need or a request to create a server, the server will need a place where it will store its file. And this place can be EBS. So EBS volume attached to an instance persists independently from the life of the instance. I explained this earlier. If you attach, like look at this, although I know this is just a simple, a small image. If you attach an EBS volume to a server, when somebody go on this server, now and maybe save a file on this server, the file will be saved here. So what you can do is that you can cut off the connection between them. You can remove this EBS away from this server. And guess what? You can now go and attach the EBS to another server. And the information or the data that you saved from this server, you can find it on this server. So an Amazon EBS provides the ability to also create a snapshot. So if you want to save a copy of whatever you saved on this server, you can save it in form of an snapshot on the server. So let's look at the let's take a second look. I mean, let's look at the second one, which is instant store. But before we look at that instant store, I want to take you back to this image. If you guys remember this image, although this is an abstract of a bigger image that we have used in the past, this image is telling us something. If you look from here to here, that is our virtual server. And this is like your regular EC2 instance. So what this is, or why this is, your EC2 instance, which is your VM, is actually sitting on a physical server. So when you deploy an EC2 instance on your AWS platform, that server or that VM is actually sitting or is actually launched on a physical server in an hidden place or in an AWS data center. So that server that physical server actually have its own storage. So when you are saving data on your EC2 instance, the storage on that EC2 instance, if the storage is an instance store, then what it simply means is that you are indirectly whatever you are storing on the instance store, you are indirectly storing it in this place, the physical server storage. So that is why you cannot detach the storage from the server. That's the main thing. Because if you take this VM, if you take this EC2 instance and take it, maybe you terminate it, that means it's going to go away from this server. So because it's going away, it can't take this hard drive with it, and you cannot remove the hard drive. So that is why the data that you saved in an instance store does not persist after the death of the server. I don't know if you guys understand that, but if you don't clear, if it doesn't clear properly, you can rewatch the video. So let's look at it now. This is your EC2 instance, and this is an instance store. So the same way, when you set data on an instance store, it's storing on this physical server. So the question now is, how do you know when the data that you stored on an instance store does not persist? Because it's not all the time that the data that you stored on an instance store does not persist. And this is what happens if you store a data on an instance store. If that instance from where you store the data, remember, let's say this is your EC2, and this is an instance store that is attached to an EC2. And this is your EC2 volume, EC2 instance. If you save a data here, the data will be stored here in the volume. And the volume will eventually save the data in the physical server. So the question is, what happened or what will happen if this server is gone? What happened if the server is gone? Do we still have the instance store? Absolutely no. And these are what happens, what will happen. If the instance is reboot, if you have an EC2 instance that is using an instance store, if you reboot the instance, not terminate and not stopped, if you just reboot it, just like, let me see, if you go here, let me see, do I have any instance currently running? If you reboot the instance, okay, good, I have one that is currently running. So let's assume that this server is using an instance store. If you click on it and go to state and reboot, this is reboot. If you reboot the instance, if this instance is using instance store, the data that you store on the instance store will persist, meaning that you will not lose the data. But immediately you go far, instead of rebooting, if you stopped the server or you terminate the server or you hibernate the server, any of the three, the data on the instance store will disappear. The data you store on the instance store will disappear. So this is why it is not always advisable to use instance store if you can use elastic block storage. Elastic block storage will persist, but instance store will not persist in case of stopped, hibernated, or terminated. So this is one part or one type of the storage, block storage. Then the second type of storage that we have is called the file storage. When we talk about file storage, every server, every laptop, every computer, they have files and folders or folders and files that they are using to perform their compute task. Let's assume that somebody gave you a task that, hey, this server, configure this server so that the server can run some software such as web server, Jenkins, Ansible, maybe for DevOps, Ansible, Docker. And if you go on each of the server and be configuring the server for this, maybe you have like 10 server to configure. If you go on each of the server and start configuring web server, Jenkins, Ansible, and Docker, then before you know it, time has gone. So what you want to do in some cases is that you want to use a share file. Meanwhile, you will just create the configuration in one place and all the 10 server will be able to use that same configuration. And another means is that you might create a file. Maybe you are working with a large group of people and you create a file, you work on a file, and that file, another person needs to work on it. Then one way of sharing that file is to share it over the internet by sending the file maybe through an email to the other people that want to work on it. But one way that companies always do, or one thing that company can do, is just to have like a shared server where you can put this file and everybody in the organization can have access to that shared file. And not only users or people, even computer too, other computer, we have access to it. Computer too, we have access to it. So this way, not only you, so this way, not only you, we have access to that file, even everybody, computer, people will be able to collaborate. So that's one use case of a shared storage. So this is an example of one or multiple computer or multiple server sharing the same file storage or file server. This can store file, it can store it here, and this server can access it. AWS provides us a file storage, and that file storage is called EFS, Amazon Elastic File System. So it's just you create like a server or a file storage, and that file storage can be attached or mount to multiple server. So if you go on this server, let's call this server A. Let's say this is server A, server B, server C. If you go on server A and type or save a document, let's call this document hello world. Hello world.py. That's a Python file. And you write some command there, like maybe cat etc pass wd. Let's say you just write this command, or no, don't use the command. Let's say you save a file there. Let's say you save a file. This is a file. You save this file. Let's say you save this file on this server. If you save the file directly on this server, then this server will not be able to access it. This server will not be able to access it. So the best option is, instead of saving it on this server, you can write a file here from this server A, and you will save it on the file on the shared server. So what this will do is that every other file, every other server, we have access to it. So if you move away from this server and you come to this server, you will still be able to have access to hello world.py, and you can modify it. If you save something on it from here, if you come here, you will see whatever you saved from here, you will see it here. So that is the benefit of shared file system. Then the last type of storage is called the block storage, object storage. The object storage is kind of a storage that is store an object plus the metadata of that object. The metadata of an object is just an information about an object. Let's say you go out with your family and you now snap some picture. You snap some picture. That picture, if you look at that picture is an object on itself. But that picture has some information about the picture, like when you snap it, where you snap it, and how big is the file. It's the size of the picture. So these are information about the picture. So the picture itself is the object, while this information are the metadata. So metadata is just an information about the object. So if you have a requirement to store an object together with the information about that object, then object storage is the best option, or is a good option. So the use case is always different. Let's say you have a website, and the website, maybe you are selling some items on the website, right? So if you are selling an item on the website, among those things that you will need on your website are pictures or images of that items that you are selling. Those images, if you also store the image on the same website that you are storing the file that is displaying the website, that means the file for the website, if you are storing that file together with the pictures that the website is displaying on the same server, then that server will be extremely slow. So one thing that people do is they will store those files or those pictures on a different server, and they will connect them together. So anytime somebody goes to your website, if they click a picture or an icon, it's going to display a bigger version of that picture. That bigger version of that picture is actually coming from a different server or a different location. So you can use that as an object storage. So like I said, the use case of each one is always different. So Amazon or AWS also have an object storage, and this is one of the most used service in AWS, or one of the most used services on AWS, which is Amazon S3, simple storage service. So with the simple storage service, is a service that provides object level storage. Amazon S3 store data as objects. So whatever you want to store in an S3, it will store it as an object. And not only that, it also stores the information about that object. So you can use S3 to store your website. You can use it as a backup and restore, and you can use it for an application too, or to store data for an application. So when we talk about S3, one of the main features of an S3 is that you pay only for what you use. You can create 10 buckets on AWS. If you do not store any data inside those buckets, they will not charge you for it. Is when you start storing data in the buckets, and when you are retrieving data from the bucket, that is when you will start being charged. And this can be a little bit different, because let's say you have a bucket. When you send data inside that bucket, AWS won't charge you for it. They will not charge you. No charge. If you send data inside a bucket, they will not charge you. But what they will charge you for, if you store the file in the bucket, that means the file, you store it inside the bucket, you will be charged. If you remove or retrieve this file, you will be charged. But they will not charge you for this process of sending, they won't charge for it. But immediately you leave the file inside the bucket, which means you are storing the file in the bucket, you're going to be charged. Anytime you try to retrieve the file, you will also be charged. But the charging can be different, and there's a lot of discounts based on how many files that you've requested. So there are different classes of S3 buckets, and the amount that you get charged for an S3 bucket depends on two things, mainly two things. The retriever, how often and how quickly do you want to retrieve object that you store in the bucket, and how highly available do you want that object that you store in the bucket to be. If you want to make sure that, hey, let's say your organization have a file that can never be lost, a file that can never be lost, then you want to be very careful about that file, because if you lost that file, if your organization lost that file, that's the end of your organization. Then you want to make sure that this file is protected. So in that case, AWS have ways of helping you to make sure that your file, instead of storing this file in one place alone, AWS will store it in multiple places, so that excuse me, if anything happened to one, then you still have a copy of that same file in another location. So we're going to be discussing about Amazon S3 service. Amazon S3 classes of S3. The first class is S3 standard, and that is like the regular one. When you create a bucket, if you do not specify anything or you do not select any class, this is the class they will give you by default. This is the class they will give you by default, and that is standard. And what that simply means is that, or the standard is that AWS will store your file in 3 different, minimum of 3 different availability zone. And they will charge you the regular amount. But if you want to save costs on these charges, because if you store your file here, then they will charge you regular amount, like a standard price. But if you want to save costs, then it's always advisable not to store your data in standard if you know how often do you need the data. If you don't need the data or the object, maybe you don't, after the first 30 days, then you won't need the data or the object again, then it's not advisable to just leave it inside the standard bucket. So what are the other bucket classes? We have the standard infrequently access, and the level of accessibility or the frequency of the the frequency, how frequent do you access the bucket or the object is what really matters here. How frequently do you access the object is the major criteria. If you have an object that you are not going to be accessing, maybe let's say you collect a file and the first 30 days you are accessing it, just like most of you. When you buy a book, you will read that book. Maybe for the first 7 days, the book will be your friend. Then after the 7 days, you go and keep the book somewhere. So the same way with an object. If you save an object in a file, in a S3 bucket, if you know that this object, you will not be accessing it regularly after the next 30 days, then you can move that object to infrequently access. That means you are not going to be accessing it frequently. So that will save you some money. It's simple, it's similar rather to the standard class. It's similar to the standard class, but the difference now is that you are not going to be accessing it every time. It will still store your data in minimum of 3 different locations, but you will not be accessing it every time. If you need access to it regularly, then always leave it in standard. Because when you save the bucket, when you save the object, we determine how quick you can access it. If you have a file that you always access, and if you need it, you must get access to it minimum, maybe like 2 minutes, 1 minute. And let's say it's a file that you access every day, then you don't want to move it to infrequently access. Because if you access a file every day and you move it to infrequently access, the charge is going to be much. It's going to be more than if you store it in standard. Because here, they will charge you for retrieval, and they will also charge you for storage. And the retrieval here, let's say they charge you 20 cents. I'm not sure, I'm just saying 20 cents. And they charge you storage for like 30 cents. This is just an example, not the case. So this is like 50 cents if you only access it one time in a month. And let's say this standard, they charge you for storage for like 50 cents. Or let's say they charge you for storage for like 60 cents because it's more expensive than the infrequently accessed. And retrieval, and they charge you for retrieval like 5 cents. So here you are going to be paying 65 cents for one, right? But because you access it, let's say you are now you retrieve 5 from here like 10 times. That's 10 times 50. That means you're going to have 50 cents. So 50 cents plus 60 cents. That means we are looking at, all these are just example, right? I just want to prove something. So that means we are looking like $1.10 because you retrieve 10 times. If you retrieve 10 times here too within that same month, that is 10 times 20 cents. That is 200. 200 plus 30. That is, you are having almost 230 cents. That's $2.30. You can see it's more expensive if you retrieve multiple times. So that is why you only want to store data that is infrequently accessed here. And the third one is S3, one zone infrequently accessed. So this one is different from infrequently accessed because the infrequently accessed, we store your data in minimum of 3 different location or availability zone. But S3 one zone infrequently accessed is also infrequently accessed, but it's going to store your data. It's going to store your data in only one location. So if you have a file that can never be lost, then you don't want to store it here. So the only kind of data or object that you want to store here is the object that you can recreate. Meaning that if it's lost, you can recreate it back. It's not mission critical. Not mission critical, or you can recreate it. Those are the kind of file or object that you want to store here. And it has a lower storage price because it's only using one location. And the next one is intelligent tiering. The intelligent tier. So this we look at the level of, we use automation to look at how often do you access the object, and it uses that to move the object from one location to another. It uses that to move it uses how often do you access the file or the object, then use it to move the object from one location to another. And there are still more of them. We have glacier. The glacier is of 3 types. We have the instance retriever, flexible retriever, and deep archive. And the difference between these 3, or the similarity between these 3, is that you use it to archive data. Or archived object, like the object that you don't really need again, but you need to store it. Like most company, they are required to store maybe like customer receipts, or customer, like let's say you buy, or your file tax now, file tax, that your tax document, you are expected to keep it for like 5 years to 7 years. So this kind of data is what you stored in an archive. Or a company like a bank, if you go to a bank and borrow money, like you borrow money and you fill a form, those forms, they have to keep it for some years. And the same thing with other companies. The information they gather from you, they have to keep it for some years before they can discard it. So that kind of information, they don't need it, but they can't throw it away immediately. So those are the information they are going to archive. And that kind of information, you don't want to put it in a storage bucket that is going to be expensive, or that is expensive. You want to save it in a very low expensive, extremely low expensive bucket. So that is why we have glaciers. So the difference between these glaciers is how quick can you retrieve data if you need a data, or the object. If you need the object, if you store an object there, if you need the object, how quick can you retrieve it? The first one is instance retriever, and it has an instance retriever of milliseconds. That if you store an object there, you can retrieve it, or if you need it, you can get it within milliseconds. The second one is flexible retriever, which has a retriever of between minutes to an hour, minutes to hours. So if you need an object that is stored in a flexible retriever, then you are rest assured that you will get it between minutes and hour. But if you use deep archive, you have to give AWS 12 hours. So they may get the data for you before the 12 hours, but you have to give them a 12 hours time frame before you get your data. So when you request for the data and when you get it is between 12 hours time frame. So if you need a data very urgent, I mean, you can store it in deep archive. So those are the classes of S3 buckets. And there are a lot of features of S3 buckets, but these are the main one that we just need to focus on. The object storage, it is highly durable, scalable, and secure. AWS said if you store an object in an S3 bucket, you have 99.119 assurance that you will get your object back. That is a very thick assurance or big assurance. They tell you that your data, your object can never be lost. It's close to impossible. So that's the availability and durability. Excuse me. Then when you store an object in a S3 bucket, let's say you write a memo or you write an article and you store it in an S3 bucket. Let's say the article just say, this is my name. Then you store it in a bucket. Then you discover like, oh, this is not what I should write. I should have write my normal name. This is my new name. If you save this, it's going to be, if you enable versioning, this is going to be saved as version 1. If you go back and modify the name, like, oh, this is my new name. Then if you now resave it, it's not going to override the first one. It's just going to save it, the second one, as version 2. Excuse me, guys. Sorry about that. So it's going to save the second one as version 2. And if you modify again, it's going to save it as version 3. So what was the benefit of this? The benefit of this is that if eventually you now discover like, oh, I don't supposed to modify the file, I need the previous version back, you can easily get either of the previous version back. But in a situation whereby you have override the previous version, then you won't be able to get it back. Then the security, there are multiple means of protecting the data or the object that you store in an S3 bucket. One of them is you can encrypt the object at rest and in transit. You can enforce every data or every service or object that want to send objects to this bucket to make sure that they are using encryption in transit. That means they are using HTTPS to send it or any means of encryption. So there are multiple ways of doing that. And you can configure several lifecycle management for your bucket. And example of that, we've discussed it. Like you can move file from one location to another based on the uh level of accessibility. All right, this is all about storage. When we get to solution architects, we go deeply into this, and we also create services on the console under solution architect. But here, just to familiarize you with the different storage services that we have in the cloud. The next one is database, but I will push this. We will continue this in our next class, which is Saturday, by God's grace. So we talk about database and we pick up from there. Any question before we close for the day? Any question on storage? All right, if there is no question, if you have question, don't forget, you can drop it in the Telegram, or you can leave your question in the comment section. When I see it, I will address it from there. All right, thank you guys. Good night.